Imagine you're sitting in a laboratory. The air is kind of stale, and there's that faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. A scientist is standing right next to you, dressed in this crisp white lab coat, and he calmly instructs you to press a button on a machine. You press it, and someone in the very next room screams in pain. You freeze. Your hands are starting to sweat. You look over at the scientist, looking for a way out, and he just coldly looks back and says, "Please continue." Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a deeply chilling case study of human nature. We're going to explore the mechanics of power, influence, and honestly, uncover a pretty dark truth about how our society functions.
It really is the ultimate question, isn't it? Would you obey? Now, your immediate gut instinct is probably a very resounding no way. We all experience this kind of cognitive dissonance. I mean, we love to believe that our moral compass is absolute, that if we were ordered to hurt a total stranger, we would just stand up, say absolutely not, and walk right out of the room. But back in 1961, a pretty horrifying psychological experiment proved that our self-perception is, well, dangerously flawed.
And here is the jarring reality of that experiment: 65%. A staggering 65% of the participants in that 1961 study delivered what they fully believed were deadly electric shocks to another human being. They didn't just give them a little zap. They went all the way up to the absolute maximum voltage on that machine. We're not talking about a handful of sadists here. This was the vast majority of normal, everyday people.
Part 1. The experiment setup. To wrap our heads around how ordinary people could commit such severe acts, we have to look closely at the methodology. This famous lab study was designed by a Yale University psychologist named Stanley Milgram. And here's the kicker. When volunteers showed up, they had no idea they were being tested on obedience. They were told they were just doing a standard, totally routine study about learning and memory.
Okay, so let's clearly define the roles here, because this dynamic is the whole core of the setup. First, you have the teacher. This was the actual volunteer, the true subject of the experiment, who's tasked with administering the shocks. Then you have the learner. Now, the learner was secretly an actor playing the part of another volunteer. Their actual job was to deliberately answer memory questions wrong and just pretend to get shocked. The teacher, the real participant, never had a clue this was all staged.
So the rules were simple, but they got brutal really fast. Every single time the learner gave a wrong answer, the teacher was told to hit them with an electric shock. And with every mistake, the voltage went up. It started super small, 15 volts. Barely a tingle, right? But then it scaled up to 150 volts, up to 300 volts, finally reaching this terrifying maximum of 450 volts. The teacher was literally punishing the learner, escalating their pain with every single press of that switch.
But here is the massive twist that makes this entire thing so fascinating. The screams? They were completely pre-recorded. No actual shocks were ever delivered. The actor in the other room was sitting there completely safe and sound. But, and this is absolutely vital to understanding the human behavior we're looking at today, to the sweating, trembling participants sitting at that control panel, the agony was 100% real. They entirely believed they were hurting someone.
Part 2. The moment everything changed. Because look, it's one thing to press a button when the other person just winces a little. It is another thing entirely when the voltage gets dangerously high. As the experiment went on, the pre-recorded responses of the learner escalated dramatically. They began to scream. Then they began to actually beg to be released. They even started complaining about a heart condition. And eventually, horrifyingly, the room fell completely dead silent, implying the learner had either passed out or something much worse.
Of course, the participants reacted to this. They were in immense, visible distress. They argued with the scientists. They pleaded to stop the experiment. But whenever a panicking participant tried to halt the process, the scientist in the room would just deploy a series of incredibly calm, rehearsed responses. Things like, "The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. Please continue." There were no threats, no weapons, literally just the quiet, firm insistence of a guy in a lab coat holding a clipboard.
And despite the intense visible distress, some participants were sweating profusely, they were biting their lips to the point of bleeding, some were even having fits of nervous laughter or just full-blown physical shaking. Yet most people simply obeyed the lab coat. Only a tiny fraction of participants refused completely. The sheer psychological weight of that authoritative environment just completely crushed their personal morality.
Part 3. The psychology of authority bias. How does something like that actually happen? Look, Stanley Milgram wasn't studying the dark depths of human cruelty here. He wasn't out looking for sadism. He was studying our relationship with power. He was uncovering a deeply ingrained mechanism built right into the human psyche.
Right, and to really understand it, we have to look way back at our evolutionary roots. For thousands of years,
Humans survived as heavily social creatures. Our ancestors' survival depended entirely on following tribal leaders. If you stepped out of line and questioned the leader, you risked getting kicked out of the tribe, which basically meant certain death out in the wild. So our brains literally evolved to trust leaders and experts because it helps society function. But today, that ancient survival instinct creates a massive modern vulnerability. We blindly trust experts, institutions, or really anyone who projects an aura of authority.
So the crucial point is this. When an authority figure appears legitimate, like, say, a confident scientist at Yale University, our brain performs this deeply problematic little trick. We basically turn off our own moral judgment. The psychological burden of responsibility feels entirely transferred. The participant pressing the button stops feeling like a moral agent and starts feeling like merely an instrument. In their mind, the authority figure becomes responsible for the outcome, not them.
Part 4, why this matters today. You know, it is incredibly easy to look at those grainy black and white photos from 1961 and just brush it off, thinking, well, that was a different time, in some sterile laboratory. But Milgram's experiment was never actually about the laboratory. It was an X-ray of the human condition. It was about all of us, right here, right now.
Exactly. We might not literally have a guy in a white coat ordering us around today, but think about who actually dictates our actions.
Bosses,
Experts in academics,
social media influencers,
politicians holding massive rallies.
even algorithms.
I mean, we blindly follow the GPS, the search results, the social feed. The delivery system has definitely changed, but that blind obedience to perceived authority, it remains exactly the same.
And when you project this human trait across all of history, the implications are just staggering. Immense harm in our society, whether we're talking about corporate fraud, political oppression, or massive historical atrocities, is so often committed by perfectly ordinary people who aren't inherently evil at all. They are simply doing what someone in authority told them to do. They're just following orders.
This really drives home the ultimate cognitive dissonance that this whole explainer leaves us with. On one side, you have what we desperately want to believe. We stubbornly hold on to the idea that we would be the hero, the one to resist. But on the other side, you have what the experiment actually suggests. The overwhelming statistical probability is that we would obey. And that is an incredibly uncomfortable truth to sit with.
Absolutely. And perhaps the most disturbing fact of all is the demographic breakdown of Milgram's subjects. Just look at who was actually administering these lethal shocks. It wasn't hardened criminals, it wasn't some fringe group. It was teachers, salesmen, engineers, parents. They were completely ordinary folks from the local community. They were, literally, in every sense of the word, just like us.
Which leaves us staring right back at the very question we started with, but now carrying a much heavier burden of context. As we wrap up this explainer today, I really want you to honestly ask yourself, if you had been the one sitting in that dimly lit laboratory, if the man in the white coat told you that you had absolutely no other choice, would you have actually stopped pressing the button? Or would you have continued?